Labeled as misfits, heretics, and outcasts are some of the world's most notable historical figures who ended up being right. But it's their stories that beg the question: what other historical figures have had their work covered up by an accepted narrative? Number 10. Kotoku Wamora's political career began in the post-war era, a period of change and growth. It was Kotoku, the 10-time elected mayor, who would lead Fudai, a village in Japan, through such progress. The village, relying on fishermen and tourists, found itself nestled just over 300 miles away from Tokyo. It was a place that was dependent on the sea for business. So why would this leading figure decide to build a wall around it? Well, he'd witnessed the unpredictability of the Great Waters and how truly dangerous they could be. He was present during the harrowing 1933 tsunami, one that reached 94 feet. He also heard stories of the 1896 tsunami, which was surprisingly worse. Fudai's residents were at a constant risk. From an early age, Kotoku made it his mission to ensure that his village wouldn't suffer this fate again. So in 1967, as mayor of Fudai, he enlisted the help of the local government, who would build a massive 51-foot-tall sea wall around the village's homes. Although aware of the risks tsunamis posed, the citizens were not happy. They deemed this idea excessive and unnecessary. They even went as far as calling the seawall a gross misuse of resources. Building such an immense structure was costly, both financially and logistically. Still, Kotoku ignored them and proceeded with his plan. The next installment was the floodgate, one that was just as tall as the seawall. It took over a decade to complete a project that may never be tested by a major, destructive tsunami, one that met the same standards as the 1933 event. So of course, the whole plan was met with much skepticism. While the project was conceived in 1967, construction would begin in 1972 and last until 1984. By then, Kotoku was reaching the end of his political career, and just 3 years later, he would retire. It was his very last project as the mayor of Fudai, one that he knew would one day come in handy. Unfortunately, he would never get to see his floodgate in action, as he passed away in 1998. He was mocked by the adversaries, the citizens, and even other countries. But then, 2011 rolled around. Japan is positioned right upon a dangerous tectonic edge and is often plagued by earthquakes. That year, a massive quake would shatter all forecasts. The result was damage to the Fukushima nuclear plant. Radiation was released, and the rumbling of the ground prompted the formation of a tsunami. Right in the pathway of that massive tsunami on that fateful day was Fudai. Waves came crashing toward the village, leveling everything in their path, including everything that lay outside the floodgate. Trees were washed away, coastal homes reduced to rubble, and ships were wrecked. But luckily for the village, Kotoku's wall stood sturdy. Workers activated the floodgates system, sealing off the village from the growing wave. And when it subsided, Fudai was left almost entirely unscathed. There was very little damage to the buildings, and only one fatality was recorded. That fatality actually occurred from outside the walls, when a man went to check on his boat in the port. Kotoku saved thousands of lives that day. Initially ridiculed for his immense shield, labeled as a folly, the wall proved useful after all. Number 9. New ideas, concepts, and narratives that go against the accepted understanding are often met with disagreement and skepticism. This is especially the case when it comes to the medical field, where new developments begin to toy with human health. It was this very pushback that Barry J. Marshall was met with when he decided to challenge the cause of a particular medical issue that's regarded as a myth today. First, we must meet the man who was brave enough to challenge the status quo. Marshall, a physician born in Western Australia, obtained his bachelor's degree from the University of Western Australia back in 1974. 3 years later, he began his brief position at the Royal Perth Hospital, and later taught medicine at the university, from which he graduated while simultaneously being a research fellow. In the early 80s, Marshall's eye landed upon some curious research being conducted by Dr. J. Robin Warren, who in 1979 observed something strange. While taking a look at the biopsy of a patient's stomach lining, he noticed a curious spiral-shaped bacteria. The scientists teamed up and began trying to figure out what this was and the significance of the bacteria. After obtaining biopsies from some 100 patients, they noticed that each had the same bacteria, and each of those patients was suffering from one of three things: gastritis, duodenal ulcers, or gastric ulcers. It was at this moment that the accepted cause of ulcers was about to be challenged. At this time, it was strongly believed that ulcers of all kinds were directly caused by stress and lifestyle, which led to excessive acid, damaging the lining of the stomach. Doctors noted that it was often businessmen with harsh jobs who were among the affected, along with cigarette smokers. The treatment for this saw alterations in the diet, eating bland food and taking over-the-counter antacids. For women, of course, it was different. They were merely referred to a psychiatrist, their ulcers naturally being psychosomatic. So stress was reduced, diets were changed, and antacids were fed to anyone willing to buy them. A money-making scheme that Marshall and Warren were about to reveal. Using their findings, the two named the bacteria Helicobacter pylori as the real cause of the ailments. But a bachelor's degree couldn't guarantee that anyone was going to listen to them. It was a contradiction in the medical field and was certainly met with pushback, ridiculed even. Warren and Marshall had discovered that ulcers weren't just the result of lifestyle and stress factors, but could actually be effectively treated with something as simple as antibiotics. The idea, though, that such a bacteria could exist in an acidic environment was a contradiction. It was a preposterous suggestion in the community that's deeply entrenched in its belief system. Challenging the dogmas was not going to be quick and easy, but the pair of scientists were absolutely convinced that they were onto something big enough for an incredibly bold experiment. Frustrated by the lack of support in the medical field, Marshall concocted a broth made with the secret ingredient, the H. pylori bacteria. Pouring his mix into a glass, the crazy doctor gulped it down. He was now infected, and within days, the symptoms began. Gastritis, nausea, vomiting, and gastric discomfort were things that he'd never experienced before, thus confirming that H. pylori could and would colonize in the stomach and cause inflammation that results in ulcers. A biopsy confirmed that the bacteria had colonized, presenting the first bit of actual evidence that linked the bacteria to peptic ulcers. Then Marshall took a dose of his crucial remedy. The cure was nothing more than a round of simple antibiotics. After further peer-reviewed studies, Warren and Marshall's hypothesis was accepted. The standard treatment for gastric ulcers today is a combination of proton pump inhibitors and antibiotics. Number 8. Barry Marshall wasn't the only one poking a hole in an already accepted theory. Galileo Galilei is one of the most notable historical figures. He was an Italian natural philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician. He could do it all and made crucial contributions to the sciences we know today. His formulation of inertia, parabolic trajectories, and the use of experimentation to discover the facts about nature, as well as his discoveries with the telescope, are all part of the modern world. Galileo's opposition to the accepted understanding earned him the label heretic by the Catholic Church, who grew increasingly annoyed with his supposed discoveries. It was following the invention of the telescope and the writings of Nicolaus Copernicus that these controversies would begin, including the one known as the Galileo affair. Copernicus had proposed a bizarre idea, known as the heliocentric theory. The concept refers to the position of Earth in conjunction with the Sun. More specifically, it challenged the idea that Earth was the center of the entire universe, and that everything else revolved around us. The heliocentric theory suggested that it was the Sun that was truly the center of it, and that Earth, along with its planets, was circling it. But this narrative would disqualify us humans from selfishly being at the heart of it all. With knowledge of this theory, combined with the 1609 invention of a 3-powered spyglass, Galileo's career was about to take a dramatic turn. After getting his hands onto one such device, he created improvements to it and produced increasingly powerful telescopes. He soon began to jot down the phases of the moon, new stars that weren't visible thanks to the naked eye, and Jupiter that had 4 moons revolving around it. They were earth-shaking and narrative-shattering discoveries. His observations, though, undermined accepted cosmology and challenged the idea that there was one center of motion in the universe. The phases of Venus that Galileo observed seemed to confirm the heliocentric theory, along with observations made about Mercury. The astronomer became firm in the belief that Copernicus was right. Galileo took his work to the Catholic Church, the most important authority of the era, but the clerics were in disbelief and named him a heretic, one who was contradicting the veracity of Holy Scriptures. Still, Galileo maintained his position and argued against biblical claims that refuted the Copernican theory. He would even go to Rome in an effort to defend his ideas, but his mathematical models, telescopic data, and intellect were no match for the Catholic authorities. So, in private, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine warned him that if he didn't comply with the orders of the Church and stop writing such heresy, he would have to pay the price. It was the 17th century in Italy, and Galileo knew he had no choice. He had to accept the Catholic Church's declaration that the theory of the Earth revolving around the Sun was false. The decree named the Index of Prohibited Books not only listed that theory, but also banned Catholics from reading any of Copernicus's books. Although this decree was in place, Galileo continued his work in secret until 1633, when he was tried and found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy, and so continued the infamous Galileo affair. Then, miraculously, following the conclave that instituted Pope Pius VII to the throne in 1822, the decree by the Sacred Congregation of Inquisition was approved, allowing the printings of books that advocated for the theory that Galileo was hell-bent on. Several books pertaining to both the astronomer and Copernicus were banned. It was that year that the final say-so in regards to the heliocentric theory was made. The Catholic Church, through further investigation and studies, declared that the Earth does revolve around the Sun, and that the Sun was at the center. In 1992, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that the Church had persecuted Galileo unfairly. He was not a heretic after all. Number 7. It was the 1800s, a time in which medicine was still a developing concept. The 1700s saw the establishment of medical schools, where apprenticeships became a thing of the past. By the following century, ventures into new concepts like germ theory and the causes of disease and contamination were still being explored. Among the notable doctors of the era was Joseph Lister, who proposed an idea that was still met with much controversy, even though he attended the very medical schools that were being instituted. Lister, of course, wasn't alone. There were a few select individuals who'd long been challenging the accepted narratives, forming new ideas, and having their work buried. It was during the 19th century when successful operations and treatments were underway. Doctors, though, often cheered prematurely because not long after these successful surgeries, their patients would pass away from infections, including conditions like sepsis and gangrene. Of course, at the time, no one knew the cause of said infection, or how it spread, since hygienic protocols were not the norm. It was then and there that the germ theory of disease came into play. Louis Pasteur speculated how the spread of microorganisms, better known as germs, could cause infectious disease. His bold claim was rejected until it eventually wasn't. It was in 1864 when Lister was introduced to said theory and opted to apply it to surgical infections during a time in which surgery mortality rate was at an all-time high. With Pasteur's theory of using chemicals to neutralize germs, Lister created a chemical barrier. He named his barrier antiseptic, which was applied to the surroundings and tools used in surgeries, preventing germs from coming into contact with open wounds. Through this development, Lister began to experiment. He made use of clinical trials that he published, only to receive some very mixed reactions and harsh criticism. His antiseptic surgical techniques were rejected by his peers, mostly because no one accepted the idea that germs were the cause of infection. In fact, many surgeons found the whole cleaning and antiseptic system much too excessive, time-consuming, and unnecessary. Nonetheless, Lister insisted that his techniques be used. He applied this antiseptic principle to a set of procedures, including a weak carbolic hand wash for staff, and carbolic acid baths for instruments. He also created solutions of carbolic spray that would be used to reduce the amount of germs in the air during operating procedures. During such applications, skeptic doctors witnessed how quickly the surgery-related infections dropped. The evidence was irrefutable. Lister was even given royal approval after using his carbolic spray during an operating procedure on Queen Victoria. Although he was initially laughed at, dismissed, and disregarded, Lister is now recognized as a world-changing doctor. Number 6. Ludwig Boltzman is another name overshadowed by the more notable scientists of history. Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, Michael Faraday, and many more. Seldom is the name Boltzmann mentioned among these great physicists, but it's he who would go on to change the understanding of atoms and physics as a whole. After receiving his doctorate from the University of Vienna back in 1866, Boltzmann held a professorship in mathematics and physics at Munich, Vienna, Graz, and Leipzig. It's safe to say he knew exactly what he was talking about. But his intellect and professionalism were called into question in 1870, when he began to publish a series of papers. It was these studies that revealed the second law of thermodynamics concerning energy exchange and how it could be explained by applying the laws of mechanics as well as the theory of probability to the motions of atoms. By applying this complicated procedure, he determined that the second law was statistical, and a system would approach the state of thermodynamic equilibrium because equilibrium is the most probable state of a material system. Boltzmann would also work out the general law for energy distribution among several parts of a system at a particular temperature. It was he who derived the equipartition of energy theorem, or the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution law. The physicist, put simply, had developed several formulas and equations that would explain the properties of atoms and how they were able to determine the physical nature of matter. His atomic theory revolved around the concept that the microscopic world of atoms was linked to the macroscopic behavior of matter. The problem was that Boltzmann's theories and formulas directly disproved the accepted existing laws of physics and scientists behind them. Contradicting another's accepted explanation and calculations, especially during this period, did not make one particularly popular among the masses. So of course, Boltzmann's work was buried, refuted, and dismissed. For years, he fought for the cause, trying to prove his atom theory, producing more papers, speeches, and even evidence, but to no avail. There were just no takers for his idea. Tragically, Boltzmann's life ended, and he never got to see his theory proven or his formulas in use. His untimely demise came just 3 years before this atom theory would be proven. It was almost 3 years later that another notable physicist, Ernest Rutherford, would discover something world-changing. It was the nucleus of an atom, the dense, positively charged center of an atom made up of protons and neutrons. Through the gold foil experiment conducted by Rutherford and his associates, Boltzmann's theory was proven and expanded upon. It provided a concrete understanding of the atom's structure and how they behave. The physicist's whole life's work was dismissed and discarded, just because the masses didn't understand. Today, his refuted claims make up a very large portion of the understanding of physics, atoms, and the behavior of matter. But Boltzmann wasn't around to see it happen. Number 5. It may come as a shock to most, but Nikola Tesla, the great Serbian-American inventor, also finds himself on this list. While generally his ideas and inventions were accepted with open arms, there's one that was subject to lengthy controversy. Tesla attended the Technical University of Graz, Austria, as well as the University of Prague, setting him on the road to greatness. While at Graz, he would see the Gramme dynamo, operating as a generator, and in reverse as an electric motor. It was there that he came up with the idea of using alternating current. While in Budapest, he would visualize the principle of the rotating magnetic field and develop the physical manifestations of an induction motor, allowing him to get one step closer to his utilization of alternating current. After having worked for the Continental Edison Company in 1882, Tesla constructed his first induction motor, and 2 years later he was sailing to America. After arriving in New York, he would find his first employment with none other than Thomas Edison. These two great inventors were both unmistakable from different backgrounds, and their invention methods were greatly divided. It was inevitable that they would separate. Edison's direct current systems found themselves in a head-to-head battle against Tesla's polyphase system of alternating current, which saw patents for dynamos, transformers, and motors. A power struggle between the two created an irreparable rift. It was the beginning of the War of the Currents. Edison's invention of a current that runs continually in a single direction saw some flaws, but at the time it was the only electricity in use across the United States. One issue was that direct current isn't easily converted to higher and lower voltages. Tesla's alternating current, though, had created a solution to this issue. Tesla promoted his inventions, revealing how his innovations could transmit power over longer distances. His creation was far more efficient for a widespread system, allowing the transmission of electricity over such distances with minimal energy loss. This, of course, threatened Edison's financial empire, and so he began a campaign to discredit alternating current. He spread misinformation and staged alleged experiments that proved that AC was far more dangerous than DC. He even went as far as electrocuting animals using AC to make a point. He also promoted his current system as a much safer option. His efforts to discredit Tesla certainly worked. The inventor struggled to keep his patents and wasn't receiving the recognition he deserved. Tesla even ventured into wireless electricity, like remote controls and radios, but these were also brushed off as being too impractical or fantastical. In 1943, Nikola Tesla would pass away in an apartment paid for by a friend. He supposedly passed from heart failure, his inventions seemingly forgotten. Except they weren't. Although he didn't get to see it happen, this great inventor's alternating current system is what runs the global electrical grid today. His other innovations, such as radios and remote controls, were recognized in later work by other inventors. Number 4. The field of botany finds itself on this list too, with the great botanist Gregor Mandel. He was born to a family of limited means in Silesia and was raised in a rural setting. Despite this minor setback, Mandel's academic abilities were quickly recognized by a priest, who persuaded his parents to send him to school. Following the completion of grammar school, he would enter the 2-year program for philosophy at the Philosophical Institute of the University of Olmütz. He excelled in both physics and math and completed his studies in 1843. After this, given the insufficiency of support, Mandel would become severely depressed. He was bound for a different life, one that saw him take over the small farm as his father's only son. So the young, aspiring scientist thought up a solution, entering the Altbrunn Monastery, where he would be given the name Gregor. Through the monastery, he was able to devote much of his time to physics and mathematics, and worked under other great physicists. Mandel's attention, though, would soon land on something else. After a brief run with the experimentation of hybridism, his interests fell to botany, in particular genetic inheritance. In an effort to understand the principles of heredity and how things passed from one generation to the next, he began to experiment and theorize, and came to his own conclusions, something that was still frowned upon at the time. His most famous test was called the pea plant experiment, in which Mandel would purposefully cross-pollinate pea plants based on particular traits, such as height and flower color. The experiment saw the use of 7 particular traits, including smooth or wrinkled ripe seeds, green or yellow seed albumen, purple or white flowers, and several stem heights. After carefully establishing 2 pea plant populations, each with different traits, he bred them with one another and observed how the offspring would inherit these features. Essentially, Mandel became the first to discover the law of segregation, in which offspring acquire one factor from each parent, the law of independent assortment, where different traits have an equal opportunity of showing up together, and last, the law of dominance, where the offspring can inherit the dominant trait and can only inherit the recessive trait if they inherit both of the recessive factors. Most unbelievably, Mandel's work wasn't read by anyone during his lifetime, because every time he tried to get the attention of renowned scientists, they dismissed him. Those who did listen to his theories couldn't understand them, and any attempt to recreate his experiments proved problematic. Mandel had even sent his work through a letter written in German to Charles Darwin, who of course didn't read it. If he had, the connection between evolution by natural selection and genetic hereditary would have been made. The botanist passed away in 1884, leaving the world with no significance to his name. But then in 1900, his work was rediscovered by Karl Corwins, Hugo de Vries, and Enrich von Schermach, each from different countries. After applying and improving upon Mendel's work, they came to the same conclusions, and today, the man who passed away as an unimportant botanist is now revered as the father of genetics. Number 3. When looking into the strange ideas brought forth by Marshall McLuhan during the 60s, it's easy to see why everyone labeled him as crazy. He thought up some seriously obscure things, like technology acting as an extension of our senses and nervous system. He also had some strange theories on media, leading him to be labeled as just that, a theorist. Marshall was a Canadian communications theorist and educator who had a pretty controversial view on the influence of technology on humans. Associated with the University of Toronto, Marshall became a full professor of English literature and began publishing several books. Among them was The Gutenberg Galaxy, The Making of a Typographic Man. This was the first of many to examine the same topic. He also wrote Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man and City as a Classroom, all of which portrayed a bizarre view. Marshall surmised that the potent influence of technology, such as television, computers, and electronic disseminators of information, was shaping the styles of human thought. Particularly, these concerned art, science, sociology, and religion. He believed that the interconnections through technological means would turn the world into a global village, manifesting through the advent of the internet. Marshall suggested that human history would be divided into 4 chapters: the acoustic age, the literary age, the print age, and the new electronic age. Of course, the whole internet concept being as advanced as it is today was not something many thought would happen in the 60s, leading Marshall to be named the crazy pop culture speculator. It wasn't until much later that his significance was truly recognized. The technological era had erupted. Those villages he spoke about manifested in the form of Facebook, Twitter, and even Google. His declaration of technology controlling us has been proven in modern times, and how companies are benefiting from our use of these devices, our privacy being directly threatened. In addition to Marshall's predictions, he even suggested that technology was going to affect the human brain and mind in terms of the thought process. Modern studies have once again revealed just how right he was. Number 2. The name Rose McGowan may sound eerily familiar. She's an American actress and director, and while this should be the reason that she's a notable figure, it's rather her unfortunate connection to Harvey Weinstein that has really brought her into the spotlight. Since the age of 19, Rose has appeared in several films, including The Doom Generation, Biodome, Scream, Devil in the Flesh, and most recently, The Sound. Unfortunately, her largely successful career would be overshadowed by her alleged assault, acted out by Weinstein. In 2017, she would go on to win a $100,000 settlement in the case, and has since been labeled as a survivor of Weinstein. But before any of this, Rose was called crazy and insane, all because of a bizarre, paranoid idea. She believed that Weinstein had an army of spies watching her every move, theorizing that her attacker wanted to keep his victims quiet. She believed that he'd hired private investigators, some of which were ex-Mossad, to spy on her after she publicly accused him of the assault. Among her accusations, she suggested that a spy was even hired to steal her memoir, the piece of writing in which she detailed the abuse she had endured in Hollywood. It seemed like nothing but paranoid delusions, and without evidence of such a thing taking place, many looked the other way. Although she was labeled as crazy, Rose refused to remain quiet, seemingly placing her in the line of fire. Aware of the risk, though, she persisted until someone would finally investigate the accusations. It was then that the extent of Weinstein's harassment was truly realized. Rose was right. He had an army of spies watching her. In fact, they were tailing the other victims too, trying to see what dirt they could possibly dig up to use against them in an effort to keep them quiet. And the cherry on top was that they were, in fact, ex-Mossad spies. It all began in the fall of 2016 when Weinstein formed his operation to suppress the allegations being made against him. Number 1. J. Harlon Brett was a geologist who would present one of the largest controversies of modern science. Brett was born in the town of Saranac, located in central Michigan. In 1913, he would graduate, completing his geology studies at the University of Chicago. After moving to Seattle, the young geologist would teach in 3 different high schools over a span of 4 years. He taught history and physiography, during which he became increasingly interested in the field of earth science, and so began the controversy. It was in the 1920s that he observed the strange formations of dry falls of eastern Washington. The area saw deep canyons and pockmarked buttes. Of course, the accepted theory as to how the landscape came to be this way was erosion. By this time, many in the scientific field believed that dry falls was created through eons of gradual erosion. But Brett believed quite the opposite, which directly contradicted the accepted prevailing principle of uniformitarianism, which suggested that the planet's landscape was created through a process that could still be observed in the present. But Brett believed that one singular, sudden, and catastrophic flood had ripped through the Scablands. The geologist suggested a flood of such massive proportions as envisioned in biblical interpretations. Such events that took place in the Holy Book had no place within the scientific field. So his theory was dismissed and deemed a throwback to catastrophism, a pre-scientific doctrine. Undeterred by his peers' failure to understand, Brett wrote another paper, providing more evidence for his controversial concept. He suggested that the flood held 10 times the amount of water than all the world's rivers combined, abruptly carving out the Scablands, plowing through the hills, and digging at the canyons. The raging water carried massive boulders with it and sent them pummeling to the ground for days, maybe even weeks, before it subsided, leaving a controlled devastation in its wake. It wasn't until his second paper that fellow geologists, who initially viewed him as a renegade, began to pay closer attention to Brett's work, and what they found was damning. It was in the 1940s when geological research came about new evidence in dry falls to support the whole biblical flood theory. They knew that they were wrong, but challenging their existing principles was still too much for them to handle. The evidence was there, but for them to accept it as such was another thing. Then, in the 70s, Brett's final vindication would come. It was during that period that satellite imagery favored this ridiculed geologist's idea. He was right, and he lived just long enough to see it happen. His once heretical idea was reinstated as the new orthodoxy, all confirmed in 1979 when Brett was 96 years old. By this time, his enemies had long departed, and he was left with no one to gloat over. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.